Good morning, everyone. It's about 10 o'clock. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, on this beautiful Saturday morning. Gracias por las personas que están asistiendo esta mañana, en esta bella temporada de la primavera. We have our presentation today. Zach Scott will be presenting the bell time analysis review. You'll see the presentation, as we move along. El señor Zach Scott es la persona que va a ser el orador de hoy y va a hablar sobre los horarios para el próximo año, el análisis y la revisión. We do have an interpreter. Her name is Angelica. She will serve as the interpreter moving forward. In the meantime, I'm just translating until we complete the norms for the presentation. Sí tenemos una intérprete, se llama Angélica. Ella entonces va a servir como intérprete después que yo explique las normas de la reunión de hoy. Okay, so Zach, if you can move to the next slide, please. Okay, so these are some norms for today. We just want to make sure that everyone that's on the call understands that this is a webinar format, and therefore we will be using the specific icons that are located at the very bottom of your screen. And so, for instance, the Q&A, you will press the Q&A if you are interested in writing in a question or a comment, and we will move forward with asking the question out loud for Mr. Scott. Para las personas que quieren hacer alguna pregunta, lo quieren hacer en inglés o en español, pueden mirar los iconos abajo de la pantalla donde dice Q y A. Usted si presiona ese icono, puede entonces escribir su pregunta y nosotros entonces vamos a hacer su pregunta en voz alta de su parte. If you're interested in asking your question yourself and asking it out loud, you can go ahead and also press raise hand. We will then call you out, basically call your name as it appears on your video. And so we will call your name and then we will ask you to unmute. Para las personas que prefieren hacer su pregunta o dar un comentario en voz alta, ustedes propio, pues pueden presionar el icono con la manita para elevar su manita. Nosotros lo miramos y entonces vamos a llamar su nombre basado al nombre que aparece en su video. Cuando ya le pedimos que le llamamos, le vamos a pedir activar su micrófono. So in terms of the chat, which is the other icon that you see at the very bottom of your screen, the chat feature will not be used as you normally would understand that it's used, where you're asking questions and providing comments. The chat actually will be available for us to provide you with any additional information like announcements. We'll remind folks that we have an interpreter as they come into the call, but we also will remind folks to, write in a question in the Q&A and also raise your hand if you prefer to ask your question live. And so again, please, you'll see that the chat will not be available. And Mr. Scott will, answer any questions as they come along. Zach, if you can move to the next slide. And then for this slide here, again, this is just a reminder, the presentation is a webinar format, and therefore you will only see the panelists that you see in front of you now on the screen. You will not be able to see everyone else that's on the call. We have about 65 individuals on the call at this time. It will continue to grow, and we're excited about that because we really want to hear from our families. Mr. Scott also will answer any questions as we move along. We will try to answer questions prior to the end of the call. And again, all microphones, again, your microphones are all off. You are all on mute. We will ask for those who raise their hand to unmute themselves so that they can go ahead and ask their question live. Entonces, las personas que necesitan traducción, por favor, si miran hacia abajo de su pantalla, deben de ver un icono que es un globo. Y ese globo entonces pueden presionar el globo y entonces le va a dar la opción de elegir español. Ya pueden entrar a este canal donde la señora Angélica va a servir como intérprete. And so for our families who speak Spanish, who need translation, I have just given them instructions to press the icon that's at the very bottom, which is for interpretation. They press the interpretation icon, and they can select Spanish to go into a separate channel. They will continue to listen to the presentation, and they will also have the opportunity to ask any questions in writing in the Q&A in English or in Spanish. The same thing for raised hand. If families are also able to ask their question in Spanish. I will interpret the question if it's made in Spanish, and Ms. Angelica will continue to serve as an interpreter so the families can hear the response from Mr. Scott. I think that's it. Thank you so much, and I will have Mr. Scott start his presentation. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Janet. And yeah, thanks to all for joining us today. I know it's a beautiful day, so we appreciate you being inside and joining us on the call. And we'll do our best to make the best use of our time together. And as Janet mentioned, what we'll be talking through today is a bell time analysis review. And I'll talk through the agenda, but just to level set, when we say bell time, we're not talking in this discussion about changing the length of the day, but really about when our schools start, and knowing that we had to change this year as we adjusted for the pandemic, but thinking forward to next year and contemplating some of the changes that we might make. So today, what we'll want to talk through we'll talk through the kind of give an overview of the transportation system, so people have an understanding and awareness of that. But then spend a lot of our time thinking about priorities. And when I say priorities, anytime you set school start times, there's a number of things you need to consider, and we want to understand from you what is most important. We'll then actually do a deeper dive into some of the different scenarios we have when we think of bell times for next year. So we have 3 that we'll look at that have different start times for next year. And again, we want to gather feedback. And then we'll open it up to questions. And throughout, we'll have 2 polls. So we'll try to get feedback throughout, but then have the time at the end for questions. So again, really appreciate your being here. And I'll start into the presentation.
Before you start, I just want to remind you that we do have Angelica who will help with translation. And as you move along, if you can just try to pause a few times, and so that way she can catch up with the explanation. Thank you.
Thank you. Bell times are exciting, so I talk quickly. So I'll try to slow down. Thanks. So a quick overview of our transportation system. We transport roughly over 13,000 students across 65 schools. And that spans both yellow bus riders, so the students that we transport on our own buses, as well as over 4,000 students who are transported on the public bus system, which is RIPTA. We serve both our schools as well as we're obligated to serve our non-public schools, which are the private and parochial schools that operate in Providence. As you'll see, it's obviously a complex system with over 150 buses, 1,600 bus stops, and over 260 routes. So lots to manage, and it's, as you'll find, it's very interconnected. So any kind of decision you make for one school is something that will impact all schools, and so that's why it's important to get as much feedback as we can to understand the impacts and the preferences of all the folks in Providence. When we think of when we're talking about yellow bus service, that is something that we offer to elementary and middle schools. And for elementary school students, it's for students that are 1 mile or beyond for their school. And for middle school students, it's for those that are 1.5 miles beyond. And at the high school level, while we don't offer yellow bus service for the most of our students, there is the public transportation option. And I'll also add that we do provide transportation to some of our special education students who have it in their individualized education plan. So there are some students beyond the eligibility here that have access to transportation. So we're going to talk through a little bit about why bell times are so important. I wanted to talk through this slide a little bit, and what you'll see here are 2 examples of how districts could organize their transportation system. And when we say bell times, we typically find schools starting at, in one scenario on the left-hand side, a district that has 2 bell times, which means most schools start at either one time, in this case 8 a.m., or a second time at 9 a.m. And then in the example on the right-hand side, you'll see a district that has 3 bell times. So with about a third of the school starting at 7:30, another third starting at 8:30, and another set of schools starting at 9:30. And the reason bell times are important is because it tells you how many buses you need, as well as how your buses do it in terms of arriving on time. So in a system where you have 2 bell times, like you see on the left-hand side, to transport 12 bus loads worth of students, it would take 6 buses, because you could actually run those buses twice in the morning, one at that 8 a.m. time and one at the 9 a.m. time. On the right-hand side, you would only need 4 buses, because you could have each of those buses run 3 times in the morning to transport those 12 bus loads of students. So in one case, you're having fewer buses, as you'll see on the right-hand side, but you'll also, when you're having a bus has to make multiple trips in the morning, there's a greater likelihood that it could be late. And so that's something that we obviously need to consider whenever we design this, is while we want to have as few buses as possible, we also want to reduce the number of, we want to make sure our buses are arriving on time. So we are considering making adjustments to bell times for next year. And as many of you know, we had to make bell time adjustments for this year. And that was as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and a need to reduce the number of students on each bus. When we know that our guidance for next year around bus capacity will likely change. And as a result, we're thinking how we might make changes for next year. So while that guidance for next year has not been set, we want to make sure we have as much information as possible so that we can make a decision relatively soon, so that people can plan ahead for next year. So what we're going to focus on in this presentation is understanding preferences around different bell time scenarios that we can review. And to share a little about where we've been in this process and where we're going before we dive in, we've met with, I think many of you or some of you early on in this process, just to share early on about what we were thinking and the rough parameters of the different bell time scenarios that we were looking at. We've been working with an outside vendor who has some pretty sophisticated technology that allows them to simulate different bell time options. And we've received that information and have been reviewing it over the past few weeks. We're in the stage now that we have that data, we've been able to review it and vet it a little bit, that we want to share that with you, as well as other key groups like our principals, our community partners, and our employee groups. So our goal is to have a decision on bell times by the middle of May. And that gives us what we hope is the right balance between opportunities to collect feedback, but also making a decision early so that people can plan appropriately for next year. So what I'll do now is, I think we are at our first poll. So you'll see a poll flash up on your screen, and we'll give people a few minutes to respond. But before we dive into scenarios, one of the things we want to understand are the different priorities that people might have. Because as you'll find in any of these scenarios, no one scenario is able to satisfy every single thing we might want to do. And so it's helpful to understand what is most important. So I'll just talk through some of these priorities very quickly, but then give people about a minute or a minute and a half to respond to the poll. And what we're asking is you to review these different priorities and tell us what is the most important, what is most important to you. So first, one priority might be prioritizing later starts for older students. So there's research that shows that later start times for middle school and high school students can benefit health and learning. And so in some cases, that's something that's very important to different groups. Second might be minimizing change from current bell times. So it's saying, I want to make sure that, I've adjusted to the bell times this year, and it's really important that there's minimal change from where we are this year. Third is the consistency of buses arriving on time or reducing late buses. So obviously buses arriving on time is important, but understanding from you how important it is compared to other priorities. Generating financial savings. So in some of these scenarios that you'll see, some allow the district to save a significant amount of money that can then be reinvested in schools. And so we'll want to understand how important that is. Length of the bus ride. So in most of these scenarios, the bus ride is about the same. but we want to understand how important that is for you, as well as options among start times within a neighborhood. So in some cases, all schools in a certain grade level are on the same bell time or similar bell time. In other cases, there are within a cluster of schools that are nearby, there might be different start times for those schools to give parents choice and options within their neighborhood among different start times. So with that, I'll pause and let people take about a minute on this poll, and then we'll take a look at some of the results before we dive in.
Zach, I just wanted to let you know that the poll is also in Spanish, but we are going to post the Spanish poll in a few minutes. It's just that it's a separate screen, and so I will share that in Spanish now. Para los padres que están en nuestra llamada, ahora mismo tuvimos algunas preguntas en su pantalla, estaban solamente en inglés, pero sí lo vamos a postear en unos segundos en español para que puedan de una vez empezar a contestar. Son una lista de preguntas cortas, solamente tienen que seleccionar opciones. Queremos saber su opinión y sugerencias. Gracias.
So Zach, we have about 50% of the attendees who voted. So I don't know if you want to stop the polling now on the English and then do the Spanish.
Yeah, maybe could we give like 20 more and then transition?
Yep, no problem.
We have, just want to let everyone know, we have about 106 folks on the call right now. Thank you so much for joining us on this beautiful Saturday.
And I'll just respond. I saw someone ask a good question about what number 6 means, and it's a fair question. So there are different, when we get into some of the scenarios, you'll see that in certain cases, we've offered different, in a specific neighborhood, so schools nearby one another, that you might have a school that starts at 8 and another school right nearby that starts at 9. And so it's understanding, is it really important to have within your neighborhood schools that start at different times? Or is it okay if all the schools would start at the same time? And in part because we understand that when people are choosing schools, it's helpful to, some people prefer to have multiple options within their neighborhood for start and end times. And Janet, I saw the Spanish poll up. Should we give similar to that, or how would you what would you suggest?
Yes. Yep. Did you want to explain a little, and then the interpreter is interpreting. Briefly.
Have the results to have? Can I see the?
You want the English results?
Yeah. Would that be possible to show them?
Sure. Natalie, if you can just post the results first of the English.
Right, so I would have to end this polling.
Okay. Well, then let's let the Spanish poll continue, and then we'll post the results maybe in another 30 seconds.
Okay, no problem.
Zach, I just need to mention something in Spanish. Para los padres que están en nuestra llamada, en un ratito vamos a mostrar de nuevo la lista de preguntas. Cuando lo vean en su pantalla, por favor, empiecen a seleccionar respuestas. Mientras tanto, por favor, espere eso. También, si quieren hacer algún comentario, alguna pregunta, por favor, utilicen el Q y el A que está abajo en su pantalla para escribir cualquier inquietud. Si no pueden escuchar la intérprete, por favor, si no pueden dejar en la Q y A, para que nosotros podamos asegurar que ustedes pueden escuchar nuestra intérprete. Gracias.
All right. Are you able to post the results?
Should be up now.
All right. Now, am I able to see? Is everyone able to see it or just me?
No, we all can see.
Yeah,
Okay, great.
we all can see it. Yep.
Excellent. All right. So I'm just going to review some of the information. All right. So obviously a lot that we'll want to review and unpack, I think, just to call out a few things that I'm seeing. One, prioritizing later starts for older students seems to be very important to folks on the call, which is very helpful to know. Minimizing change from current bell times, it seems to be less of a demand, though certainly for some. Consistency of buses arriving on time and reducing late buses also appears to be very important, as is generating financial savings to be reinvested in schools. And the length of the bus ride time for students, not as much. And similarly with number 6. So that's helpful to understand. I mean, what we'll see as we go through some of the scenarios, and why we wanted to do this up front is as we get into some of the scenarios, what you'll see is some, are perform well on certain of these options while others perform less well. Now, Natalie, does this merge both the English and the Spanish results, or do we want to see, will we be able to see those results as well?
They do not merge, but I can put up the Spanish results.
Okay, that'd be great. And we'll. Okay, so it looks like we maybe have 5 respondents. And what I'm seeing, looks like most options here were listed as important. So I think what we'll want to do is when we review all this data is merge them together. Again, it looks like later starts, consistency on time was very important. Minimal changes from this year was less important. But again, we'll want to combine those given all the respondents. Okay, let's move on and actually talk through, dive into some of the scenarios then. And so we'll frame it. What I want to do is talk through the 3 different scenarios we looked at a high level, and then we'll review each in turn. And so what we asked the vendor we were working with to do is look at 3 different scenarios. And to be candid, these aren't the only scenarios we could go with. And there might be some small changes when we go to implement, but these represented, the broad kind of set of different options that we have moving to next year. So scenario 1 is looking at minimizing the number of routes and buses and sticking with a 2-tier model. And what you'll hear when I talk about 2-tier or 3-tier, that is when that talks about the number of different bell times that we would have. So in a 2-tier model, this would be similar to what we had in the year prior to this one, where we had most of our schools starting at 8 and the other set of schools starting at 9, versus a 3-tier model, which is similar to what we have this year, where we have roughly 3 start times with schools starting around 7:30 or 8:30 or 9:30. So this first scenario is looking at a 2-tier model, but optimizing to reduce the number of buses that we have in our system. And that goes to the point of the financial savings that we had mentioned on the previous slide. Scenario 2 also looks at a 2-tier model, but it tries to prioritizes our middle schools and most of our high schools starting later, again, given some of the research on late start times for students. And then the third scenario looks at a 3-tier model. So not just the 2 start times, but 3. And in that case, whenever you run a 3-tier model, if you remember that slide we showed earlier, it greatly reduces the number of buses you have on the road and can lead to fairly significant financial savings. But we'll review that and talk through the pros and cons of each of these. One thing to note that's important for all of these options, we're not, again, just to reiterate, we're not talking about changing the length of the school day. So if the school start time changes, the end time would change accordingly. And that each school only has one start and end time. We're not thinking of a school, an individual school. If you go to, let's say, Bishop, that you wouldn't have some students starting at 8 a.m. and 9 a.m. It would be one bell time per school. And then when we talk about a two-tier model, it's having schools on different bell times, not different bell times within one school. Before we get to some of the individual scenarios, one thing to talk through is again consistent is we do have some constraints or considerations we want to have for any of this, and so there are only kind of a certain degree of flexibility we have in making changes. So I wanted to talk through some of those that you'll see kind of guide the scenarios that we get into. So first, we wanted to consider either minimizing the number of schools with changes or maximum time change, knowing that a 1 hour or 2 hour change in time could be fairly disruptive. So we tried to minimize that to the extent we can. And there's some caveats as we get into different scenarios. Second is we need to factor in RIPTA, the public bus fleet limitations for serving multiple schools at one time. So RIPTA offers some additional service for our high schools at certain times, and for some of our largest high schools like Hope and Mount Pleasant on one group, and then Central, Classical, and PCTA in another group. To be able to service those schools, all those schools cannot start at the same time, so we need to have roughly an hour difference between the Mount Hope and Pleasant cluster as well as the Classical, Central, and PCTA cluster of schools. We obviously want to ensure in any of these that we're making adjustments to ensure school buses are arriving on time and are predictable. So that's something that we can talk through in each of these. We also know we need to accommodate athletics, and having a start time that is really late or an end time for high schools that are really late could be disruptive for students who are involved in athletics, and something that we'd want to avoid. And then lastly, our middle schools currently have an early release on Wednesdays, and that plays into how we have to route our buses. And so I'll talk through that in a few scenarios where that comes into play. So these are, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Zach. So before you get into the scenarios, is it possible to answer the few questions that are up now?
Sure.
Before you get into the scenarios?
Yeah. So I'll try to answer these in turn. So data regarding bus rider numbers this year versus previous years, and how the district will figure out how many folks will return to riding the bus in the future. So I don't have the exact data with me. What I'll say is, but we can gather it. Well, again, I think want to ask people to consider opting in or out. I think that's helpful in whether you're in a kind of a pandemic or not, because it just helps us ensure our buses are routed efficiently. We did have, I think, while we didn't have as many opt-outs, we also had a decent number of students who were enrolled in the Virtual Learning Academy. And so that reduced the number of students on our buses. What will determine how many students are in each bus are public health guidance. That has changed over the course of the year, where we started at 50% and it's now increased to 75%. Because our buses were already routed, we haven't kind of changed routing as a result of that. But we are looking and working with the Department of Health to understand what those health guidance is for next year, because we obviously want to, safety is paramount in this, and why we made the changes we did this year. And so we'll want to do the same for next year. And I see another good question on high schools about teens involved. And I mentioned sports, but I should have broadened that to extracurriculars. And that is something we certainly want to factor in. I can't speak to the scheduling and how different courses are assigned, but we do, for the bell time purposes, we wanted to make sure we didn't have any high schools that were ending too late, because we knew that impacted not only sports, but students who have after school jobs or engaged in other athletic, extracurriculars. Got it. Next good question about and this is what we'll see as a trade-off between that 2 bell time model and a 3 bell time model is a parent who's saying, I have a student who leaves the house at 6:45 to walk to middle school, and then my younger students have a 9:35 start. And that is much more likely to happen in a 3 bell time system where you have the kind of 3-hour spread between schools versus a 2-tier model. So that is certainly something that we want to make sure we understand the balance there. Another really good question, and one that is a difficult one to answer, is what is the decision-making criteria and how do we balance? Hey, hold on one second. Sorry, it's my daughter's birthday party this morning, so we're getting ready for that. But so how we balance different costs and benefits, and it's hard. There's no way to sugarcoat it and say how you balance the financial savings in one option versus the research that shows that starting later for older students has a benefit on academics, because you can't. It's hard. One's a financial, a benefit, and one's obviously a benefit to student learning. So we certainly prioritize the benefits to student learning always, though we know financial savings can also allow the district to invest in things that also benefit student learning. So my honest answer is that's why we're doing this type of engagement, because if it was an easy answer that you just kind of needed to do the math, then this engagement would be important. But what's really important is understanding how much does our community care about different things we weigh. And so our goal is we don't have an answer. And so it's really getting as much feedback as we can through sessions like this to understand how important it is to you. And then we'll ultimately need to weigh all the factors in making a decision. Next good question. And then I might start moving on so we can get some of these later. Another great question. These scenarios, we are thinking of this the question is this for a typical school year or accounting for any potential COVID restrictions for next year? Our goal is if in any change that we make, that it would be the change that we would stay with for the foreseeable future. Now, certainly we might need to make small adjustments or large adjustments to account for any COVID restrictions. But the idea is not that we're going to change this for next year as a result of COVID and then have to change it the following year because we're not facing any constraints. I think given that some of the capacity limits have been raised to 75%, that we could plan for a scenario. We could choose a scenario for next year, obviously keep within certain capacity constraints, and actually might need to have more buses than we would normally have, but do so because we need to keep in line with public health guidance. And I will keep going from here. And if you could just leave some of the questions up, because I'll try to answer them at the end.
Yes, go move along. Yeah.
All right, so now I'm going to walk through each option in turn. And one option I didn't mention, which we'll ask you at the end whether it is desirable, is essentially going back to the option we had prior to this year. So just returning to what was done the year before, which was actually isn't too different from what you'll see in scenario 1, though it more closer to 8 and 9. And so I'll walk through each of these. I'll try to talk through an overview of each, some of the key statistics, as well as how they stack up on the different dimensions that we mentioned. So the first scenario is a 2-tier model where we are looking to minimize the number of bus routes that we have. And what that means is there's generally 2 bell times, start times in the morning, a 7:50 start time, and then a 9:05/9:15 start time. I'll explain why there's a little bit of difference at that second tier. That would mean for our elementary schools, either a 7:50 start or a 9:15 start. That would mean a 7:50 start for our middle schools. And that would mean for our high schools, either a 7:50 or a 9:05. And that's that difference you see between the 9:05 and 9:15 is having our high school start a little bit earlier on that second tier to address some of the concerns around extracurriculars and athletics. And we're not going to show specific school bell times. And the reason is that this data is based on what we had from in our current enrollment. We understand that enrollment changes, and so any individual school might change, but broadly what this scenario would yield is about, if you look at the left-hand, that chart in the left, and I'll talk to it because it's probably a little small on your screens. It would mean the majority of our elementary schools would be starting around 9:15 with a smaller number, closer to 4 or 5, starting at that 7:50 time. It would mean all of our middle schools would be starting at 7:50, and then about half and half split between that 7:50 time and 9:05 time for our high schools. So just a few key statistics. No school shifts more than 45 minutes from the current time. The average change is around 27 minutes. And we would see a potential for reduction between 10 and 20% of our buses, which translates to a $1.5 to $2.5 million worth of savings. And because of those capacity limits we might have next year, we might not see that absolutely next year, but something that we would work to over time. So to talk through a little bit of where this stacks up on the priorities we mentioned, it does generate a solid amount of financial savings. And then on some of the other dimensions in terms of minimizing change, on-time performance, and later starts for older students, it's about what we thought of as kind of middle of the pack for our different options. For our middle schools, it's certainly a move that is better from in terms of early start time for this year, but it doesn't move it past 8 a.m. And there's, for different schools within different neighborhoods, there's not options among start times, but what I saw from both the comments and the polling, that one wasn't particularly important. So what you'll see again, strong on financial savings, and then about middle of the pack when you think of other things like later start times for older students and other things. Next, we'll look at the second scenario, which is similar to the first in that you're operating under 2 bell times, but the goal here is to have our older students, to the extent possible, prioritized for a later start. So in this scenario, you would see 2 bell times of 7:35 and 8:55. For elementary schools, about half would start at that 7:35 time, and about half would start at that 8:55 time. Our middle schools would move to an 8:55 start, and then our high schools would be prioritized again for later starts. So most of our high schools, about 2/3, would start at 8:55, with about 3 starting at 7:35. So some of the key highlights of this option are this would have our middle schools all on a second tier, so starting later. This would have the majority of our high schools starting on a later tier, though some would be on that first tier. There would be a significant change from this year, and in some cases from previous years, as well as a maximum change that is pretty significant, and it yields minimal reduction in buses, so it doesn't yield much financial savings. So how this stacks up against other options, obviously very strong in terms of later starts for older students, which seem to be something that folks prioritized in the poll. Minimal change from current, though that also didn't seem to be as strong. And then the other 2 options, if I recall from the poll, that people seem to feel most strongly about was on-time performance. So again, this on-time performance-wise is probably pretty similar to what you saw in scenario 1, but obviously is low in terms of financial savings. So when I think of scenario 1 and scenario 2, trade-offs here are the later start for older students versus financial savings in terms of what people have responded as kind of most important to them. And then scenario 3 is different from the first 2 in that it's a 3-tier model. So it's similar to what we have this year, but different than what we've had historically. And in this model, the bell times are somewhat similar to this year in that we have a 7:30, an 8:40, or a 9:30 start time. In this scenario, about, let's see, 3/4 of our elementary schools are starting at 9:30, with the other quarter starting around 8:40. Our middle schoolers are somewhat similar to where they are this year, and they're all would be all starting around 7:30. And then our high schools would be split between those first 2 tiers, again, roughly half at 7:30 and half at 8:40. So in general, this has minimal change from this the current bell times, though some schools have a small number of schools have a large change from one year to the next. It does yield a significant amount of savings, and that's just because in anytime you move from a two-tier model where you're running buses twice, you're able to run buses 3 times in the morning and in the afternoon, which allows you to greatly reduce the number of buses that you have. So in terms of ratings, how this stacks up, again, this doesn't meet the goal or priority of starting later for older students. It does minimize the change that we have, as well as does yield fairly significant financial savings. But I would highlight, I think one of the challenges is it does lead to potential for on-time performance concerns. And I should say, when we asked the vendor to build this, they were able to construct the routes in such a way that they added more time in to reduce the likelihood that buses would not be late. But there is a stronger likelihood that it would happen in this scenario. And it's just a matter of, if you can imagine a bus that has to make 2 trips in the morning versus a bus that has to make 3 trips. If a bus is making 3 trips, any delay on one of those trips is going to impact all the schools that come after it, and it's more likely to happen in a second tier. It's hard to quantify how frequently that would happen. And again, we built in some things here to minimize it, but it would, when you think of when there's inclement weather or snow or other things, or heavy traffic for whatever reason, that it just would have a kind of a stronger effect in terms of delaying buses in this scenario. So what we'll do now is we'll again put up these 2 polls and we'll ask people to choose among the 3, actually 4, which is going back to where we were pre-COVID times. And to give you a sense of how the pre-COVID would stack up, it would look a lot like scenario 1, but probably would yield less financial savings. So you'd have around an 8 a.m. and a 9 a.m. start time, but you would have fewer, you'd probably see fewer savings because you'd have buses running to closer, which would require additional buses. So we'll put this up for another 30 seconds or so, and then we'll offer it to our Spanish-speaking families. And then we'll take some time to review those results and answer some of the questions that come up. So I'll start reviewing some of the questions that have come through.
Zach, just a quick question. Someone did ask earlier if the PowerPoint would be available.
Yes, we can make the PowerPoint available. And I think we might be recording this too, so we can share it with you who either weren't able to attend or have to leave early.
Very good.
So Zach, the percentage so far, it's at 51%.
Okay, maybe we give 20 seconds or so more. And then either for you or Janet. Janet, if I start typing in answers, will people be able to see them, or is it better to just answer them all live?
As long as you're answering it, answering it live, everyone will see responses.
Okay.
So I'm gonna end the English polling and then I'm gonna put up the Spanish.
Zach, when responding, if you could just press type answer, and then that will show it live.
Okay, I'm doing that. Is that working or?
The type answer, when you press type answer?
Yeah, and then I'm hitting send.
Okay.
All right, well, I tried to take a swing at some of them, but I'll certainly have time at the end to keep going through the ones that are outstanding. So maybe could we show up the results?
I just put the results up.
Excellent.
We can see.
All right. And then do you want to, yeah, so let's talk, because I know that we can look at this results from our Spanish speaking families shortly thereafter. I think the kind of straightforward understanding here is that, very little preference for scenarios 3 and 4. And so it's, and frankly, I think that's what we had been thinking too. I think 3 there were some concerns about, and what we've heard, not just from arrival, like on-time performance, but it can mean some really late starts or really early starts for different groups of students. And then it looks like most of the interest is around options 1 and 2. And it looks like stronger, from what I'm seeing here, preference among option 2. Sorry. Let me make sure I'm reading this right. Yeah, more among, I guess, option 2, though it's fairly close when you kind of look at the different options combined. So that's again, I think shares why this is somewhat of a difficult choice, because those options between option 1 and 2, there are some very difficult trade-offs. So do you want to show up our results from our Spanish speaking families?
I just put it up.
Thank you. Again, it looks like option 2 is the most preferred here, and maybe with us, option 1 is a slight second. So very, very helpful. Okay. What I'll do next is I'll flash up the timeline just to share where we're at, but then I'll go through some of the questions that have popped up. And what I'd also ask is if people have, not in addition to questions, anything you'd suggest that would be helpful for more information that would be needed as we're finalizing this decision, or any other requests. But so again, we're looking to do this in mid-May, so we have a few more weeks to gather feedback. But I will open it up to questions and try to review those that have come in. But Jeanne, it looks like you have something.
Yeah, so someone made a comment that if you could, we know that you responded to a few questions as opposed we're running. If you can just, we'll go back to those, so then that way some folks can just hear you respond to the questions.
Sure.
You can go ahead
if I go to like the answered questions.
Yep.
Yeah.
Just quickly, we also have 2 participants with their hands raised, Nami King and Kate Hanley. Nami King has had her hand up for quite a while. Just
okay.
Yeah.
Why don't we give her? Why don't we ask her to share her question?
Oh, she put it down.
Okay. All right.
But Kate
Oh, she put it. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, she put her hand down, but yeah, Kate still does have her hand up.
Okay.
Do you want me to
Please.
allow her to? Okay.
Sorry, I just wanted to see the options again before we voted.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. I did my best.
Okay. Thank you for that.
Sure.
So a few of the options that I responded to in the chat, but I'll just speak to, there was one around, do we know which specific schools will have different start and end times? And I think some of that, there may be small changes based on the scenarios that were run. So we didn't want to share them to the extent they might change, but largely the proportions that I shared. So 2/3, when we shared in this option, 2/3 would start at this time, or 1/3 would start at that time. That's what we tried to capture. And we wanted to understand, knowing that if you're an elementary school parent, you might say, we wanted to have people understand that their individual school might start on either of these 2 times and come from it from that perspective, rather than knowing in this scenario, my school is starting on that time. So again, some of it's because it's up to change, but we also wanted to make sure we gathered feedback, knowing that this specific school might move within the times we shared.
Someone did make the question, does middle school need to have an early release?
Yeah, so a little bit, I would want to ask some of our network and academics team. I think part of that I know that's been done historically is it allows for extracurriculars, but also planning time for teachers. I think that's some of the reason that it's been done. So that's, and I know our team believes that's important. So that's why it's expected to continue. So it doesn't absolutely have to, but that's been part of the reason it's been done historically.
Okay, we do have 2 questions regarding virtual learning for next year. So whether or not it's actually going to be offered next fall.
Yeah, we don't know at this time. And we're working closely with the state and the governor's office because as public health conditions and guidance changes, it's still something we're reviewing. But we know we want to, again, similar to bell times, we'll want to make a decision soon, but we also want to make it with as much information so that parents have enough information. So I would expect more information on virtual learning options to be coming soon. Then I think the other question that was a real good one to talk through was PCTA classical and central. And I think in these scenarios, they had them all on the same they'd be on the exact same time. Historically, there's been I think a 10-minute or 15-minute gap between 1 or 2 of the schools in that cluster. So you don't have, thousands of students all out coming out at once. So that would remain in that we would have one of those offset in that, so that we would continue doing that, just given the, just wanting to minimize the number of students out in one area at one time. let me try to go through this, and Janet, if you see any that seem like really pressing, or but I'll try to do them in order that they've come in.
Sure.
Any sense of what the high school schedule means for after school activities, what time those activities, and I don't have that information, but we can gather that. I think it probably would depend on what specific extracurriculars and what athletics and the time of the year, but we can gather like what that would roughly mean. On the late start emphasis option, you know, you see that you have some high schools starting earlier, some starting later. So two things that drive that. One is because the way we need to work with RIPTA, we need to have that Mount Pleasant Hope cluster start at a different time that our classical, central, and PCTA. So the starting point is that those sets of schools need to be on different times. And then what drives which group of schools goes on which time in part has to do with how many buses are used at those schools. Because if, let's say, we need a certain number of buses to run the other schools that are operating in that bell time, it tells us how, like, it depends on how many buses we might need at each of those schools. So that's what kind of sets how the choices are made for those high schools. Can you please share the scenarios on the PPSD website? Yes, we can share. It's a great idea. We'll share this recording along with the scenarios, because as you've probably seen, it can be complicated, and we want to make sure people, if it's helpful, listen to it before they start weighing in on the votes. So really good question. So why is there financial savings between scenario 1 and scenario 2? And it's a totally good question, because you might imagine, listen, we both have two tiers. Why would one have a lot of savings, and why would one not have as much? So it's a little complicated, but I'll do my best to explain it. This has to do with the middle school early release. And so when you think of our middle schools, when they start early, like they do now, that means 1 day a week they have an early release time. And so rather than picking up whenever they do, they pick up an hour or so earlier. And that doesn't impact any other schools because they're the earliest, and so they just pick up students earlier. When you have middle schools start later, on those early release days, so when they're on that second tier, and they're normally picking students up at the latest time in the afternoon, when they have to, on those early release days, pick up students earlier, we have to add additional buses during that time, because what those buses would normally be doing when they're picking up students early on that early release day is at the exact same time they would normally be picking up students at our elementary schools. And so because of those early release days, you have to add additional buses, because when you have that early release time, the buses that normally would be picking up elementary students at those schools are now also would also have to simultaneously do middle schools, which is obviously not possible. Good question on the end time. So I can flash it up, and we'll share that in our website. Each of these has what you'll see, like let's look at scenario 1 and 2, because those are where most of the feedback was. But elementary, you'll see, is 7:55 to 2:05, and then 9:15 to 3:30. Middle school is 7:50 to 2:35. So we'll have that up there, and we can post that on our website. But yeah, it's fair that it's for planning purposes, both for adults and students starting their day but ending their day. What percentage of high school students are not on RIPTA? And given that it's a separate system, why are high school bell times influenced by middle school and elementary school? Really good question. So I don't have the data on high school students on RIPTA. We can get that. It's important to note the students that were eligible previously were over 2 miles, and we made we expanded access significantly this year to move it to 1 mile. But I can get the percentage of students who are on RIPTA. And then, given that's a separate system, why are high school bell times influenced by middle school and high school? So part of it, again, that drives why our high schools have to have different times are that the capacity limitations of RIPTA that I mentioned. So that I think tells why all our high schools would be on different times. But to I think what I understand your question to be is, why should they have anything to do with middle school and elementary school? Because they use RIPTA. And it's a small but important point, is that because some of our high schools or all of our high schools have students with special education needs or other another medical accommodation that might require them to be using yellow bus service, that some of our high schools do have yellow bus service for students with special needs. So it's not that they're totally disconnected. There just are far fewer buses servicing high schools, but there are still buses that we need to factor in. And that's why there is some, give and take that we need to do and consider it along with middles and high schools. Question, these connected to another question around like, is this for how we deal with, are these scenarios just for planning for how we operate under a pandemic? And what does it say about how kind of reporting? This is assuming normal 5-day reporting for all students in person. And that's not because we're still awaiting public health guidance, but either of these scenarios, any of these scenarios would be set up to work in a situation where we're having students report either every day or 5 days a week. But this assumes, this is planning for a 5-day, running 5 days a week. Were there any scenarios explored that moved elementary students to earlier starts and high school to the later times in the 3-tier model? We did ask them to look at that, and I think it was hard to make it work with, and I'd have to look into some of the results. But the vendor knew that we were trying to look at both reducing buses, but also at later start times for older students. And so that was something that they considered. But I don't know if it was workable given the kind of hour gap they need between those and not wanting high schools to be too late, not being able to start at 9:30 because that would be too late for athletics. Let's see. And I apologize, it looks like there's some good feedback on answering the poll. So we'll share that on the slides, and we'll also actually send out a survey. The goal is to send out a survey after this to a broader set of families. And so if that gives you time to kind of either reflect on what we're talking about now or a greater time to review the scenarios, that would be good. Yeah, it's not a question, but just to reiterate, the reason we're talking about middle and high school start times being later is that there is research out there. So that's what we're trying to do, and quoting a lot of the research and I don't want to, not a medical expert, but what some of the research I've seen is it's not about making sure they start extremely late. Like it's not that you want to start students at 10, but there was like a sweet spot of making sure students are starting after 8 is where they started 8 a.m. is where they started to see some benefits. All right, let's see where I could. There's a question, how do you factor in the current start time for high school that works for parents who transport their children to and from school? That's a little bit of a, we want to make sure that we're working and gathering feedback from all of our families, because we know that whether you're transporting your students or they're taking RIPTA, that matters. So that's part of the feedback gathering process. Let's see. There's a few, it looks like I can, a question in Spanish from Miss, are you able to see that?
Joanna Acosta.
Yes.
Right, so the parent is asking whether or not the students are in VLA right now, going to school in person for 21-22.
Yeah, the VLA, the like what virtual learning looks like, if anything, is still being decided for next year. Again, we're waiting and working with the state on public health guidance that would drive that. But we know we want to make sure we have the most information to plan for it, but also we know parents need time to plan.
Mom actually proceeds with another question regarding VLA.
Okay.
Students are not in person yet. What she might have to do to make sure that the student does return back to their original school.
Question was a student who moved to VLA and but will be going back in person next year. How do we ensure they go to their original school?
Yes.
They will be going back to their original school. I would say we can follow up afterwards and make sure you get the right information with our registration office. But that is, you know, the schools, students are still assigned to that school in our assignment system. So that is the plan. But we obviously want to make sure everyone's fully aware of that. I'll try to. Some of these look like good comments, but I'll try to jump through some of the questions. Give me 1 second. Sorry about that. Good question on how private and parochial schools factor in. So by state law, we are obligated to transport those students, and they do impact us. They tend to be smaller, so they don't typically take a number of buses, but you know, we have to accommodate. We have to transport students at that bell times, and we try to have discussions about what their bell times are, but we don't necessarily have the authority to change them. They're independent entities, and so we try to have a collaborative relationship. But ultimately, you know, when they start and end is something they're able to decide.
Zach, someone did ask the question: would families have the option for a student to go half online and half in person?
My honest answer is we haven't determined that yet. I think we're trying to, you know, for bell times purposes, we're planning on, you know, having the capacity to serve all students in person. But for VLA being half in person, half on half in person and half online has not been decided yet. Is there going to be another information session for stakeholders? Yes, we want to schedule the next few weeks. So I'll be working with Janet and Nick and their teams to do that.
Zach, someone did make a comment, might be worth asking high school students their take, and also
Great idea. Yeah, I mean, we've been trying to meet with student groups, but getting a survey to get a broader reach is a good idea. So we'll make sure to try to have that happen.
a parent did make a comment, why are these measures or options so drastic? Would they be considered drastic?
I think my answer would be, I think it depends depends on how you define drastic. Say option 3 is drastic in the sense of it's not too different from this year, but it's moving pretty significantly from what we've done historically. So that mine was fairly drastic. And then to some extent, the middle school time would be very different from what we've done in the past. But I think in any of these scenarios, the reality is it depends. In some cases, for some schools, the change is going to be fairly small from where they are today. And for others, it might be larger. So I think it honestly depends on, for some, it's a small change, and for some, it's a significant change. And we're trying to balance on the one end, you want to minimize change because people set their lives and their schedules on that. And so you don't want to impact that. But on the other hand, we want to do these things like potentially have later start times for older students, potentially reduce savings. And so it's finding that balance between, and that's why one of the things we wanted to understand is how important it is to stay as close to these current bell times. So that's what we're trying to balance here.
Aaron couldn't remember whether or not all scenarios included an early release for middle school.
They all do, yeah.
They all did.
Question on RIPTA and how that works, because we give RIPTA passes, but we don't, it's not our drivers. So what RIPTA is able to do, and what they do is they add buses where they know students will be going at, if they're going to have a large influx of riders or students, and while they aren't exclusive to PPSD, because by federal law they actually can't offer public transportation and just say this is only for students. But what they'll do is add buses, and have those buses run in places they know students will be traveling. So in a lot of those cases, the buses are the vast majority of on those are students because they run at the time when students need it and run in the direction of school where students are going. So they try to align, they try to add service when we need them. And that's part of the reason why we have that difference at the high school level.
A parent asked, how do I know if my kid is available for school transportation? Because the year before COVID, he was in elementary school, less 1 mile far from home. I would like to know if he will be able to take the bus, or for middle schools, kids are able to get bus passes or ripped a bus pass.
Yeah, so we can share that information, and it's best to contact our transportation office and they can talk about eligibility. Middle school is not, we don't provide RIPTA passes, but we do provide yellow bus service for students over 1.5 miles. And it's over 1 mile at the elementary school. So we can, we can put contact information for our transportation office. Very good question. And this is what we'll try to get at in our survey. Because when we asked it to a broader group, is what percentage of participants here are representing elementary, middle, and high? If, and obviously there are going to be different preferences among people who have different age students. And so when we survey in the broader sense, we'll want to understand, one, what if there are different preferences among different family groups to say, oh, middle school, or the majority of middle school parents want this, or the majority of elementary school students want this option. But also to ensure we're getting a representative sample, because we know that, again, depending on, what school, what grade level, you might have different preferences.
Zach, I see that it's already 11:10. I just wanted to, just mention this. If you just want to answer maybe 2 or 3 more questions. One question here that says, are you planning on keeping the 1 mile limit for high schools? It is great.
Yes. So for next year, we are keeping the 1 mile limit. And then I think after next year, after we have 2 years worth of data, we'll want to reassess. And when I say data, one of the things we'd like to look at, and one of the hypotheses has always been that giving greater RIPTA access to students will increase attendance, engagement, and other things that are important. And so we'll want to see if that bears out to be true, because we've been able to work with RIPTA to have this done at no cost for these 2 years. But in future years, we would have to pay to have this reduction in kind of the bus time or the RIPTA pass eligibility. So we'll want to, we think it's been a good thing. We want to understand how impactful it's been, and then reassess likely in the middle or end of next year. Let me see if there's another one to look at.
One question here, when will we know if before and after school care will be offered at elementary schools during 21-22 that offer it pre-COVID, that were offered prior to COVID?
That's a great question. We'll work, I think, as we start to finalize bell times in the next few weeks. Following that, we'll work to share that before the school year ends, so people know and can plan.
So we have a hand raised by Martha Moore. Can we take this?
Maybe we could take this and then end, and we'll try to answer some of these, whether we could add a little Q&A at the end of the slide deck when we post it. But are all these questions saved, Janet?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Martha, if you can unmute yourself. Martha? Martha, we are unable to unmute you. Would you unmute yourself to ask your question? Okay.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you now.
I want to ask whether you guys, the school department, will give all the RIPTA pass.
How do we distribute them or give them out?
Yep.
Yeah, so they're done at the school, at the high school level. So students and I would have Cheryl, who's our expert here, was unable to join this morning, but typically we'll distribute to schools the list of bus eligible students and bus passes, and then they provide those to students. So those are for just at the high school level. So if you're having a challenge, if you have a high school student now and there's a challenge, you can share your information in the chat, and we can follow up.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Zach. So it's 11:15. If you want to make any additional comments, and again, it was recorded. This video is actually live now on YouTube in our YouTube channel. But in terms of sharing the PowerPoint, if you want to just any other additional comments before we go.
Yeah, thanks. So just again, thank you for joining us, but also the engagement. Obviously, this is, you saw very complex, and the amount people, like your questions, obviously you were really digging into some of the stuff we've wrestled with. So I thank you for engaging in the way you have. So we'll be sharing this information online. We'll be looking to do a survey and Good Flag on finding another time to have a town hall like this, as well as surveying high school students. So we'll aim to do that as well. And we are shooting again to have this finalized in the next few weeks so that people have time to plan. But we'll make sure we do have other times for engagement, because as you saw, I think, and this is similar to as we've had discussions, there are some options that everyone looks at and says, not so much. But there are some really difficult ones we need to wrestle with, particularly around options 1 and 2. So this feedback's been helpful here, and we'll be sure we get representative feedback, because we know their preferences are different for different grades or parts of the city, depending on what the different times are in those neighborhoods. So thank you so much again, and we look forward to sharing more information with you in the coming weeks.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you everyone for joining us. Please be on the lookout for any Kinvo messages or parent link messages regarding future times webinars. And I want to thank you also to Angelica for helping us out with interpretation today. Thank you. Enjoy your weekend.